And these big disruptive forces, we know globalisation, changing boundaries, global skills, we know ICT and its influence on learning models, but as we heard yesterday, cities, and there's another group discussing this at this very moment, cities as new entities raise a whole lot of issues for education systems. It's a major disruptor in terms of bricks and mortar. Where's the space? Do you need the space? In terms of, as George Megalogenis was talking through, in terms of new levels of civic literacy, how do we actually handle the diversity and the growth in cities? Changing role of nation states, changing models of families, coming at us in rapid form, lifting to visibility, that the differences have always been there and the variation has been there, but lifting to visibility. What's the education sector's responsibility in that? Because we're asked to respond. It's a major disruptive force. And of course, science, neuroscience, biotechnology. So all of these areas, the OECD, and in this nice little book, if people are interested online, OECD, it's Shaping Trends in 2016. It's just there online. It's a good one and it raises a whole lot of questions. It's a very nice little publication to actually run some workshops around. So just to sort of the questions I looked at when I was thinking about these questions, about this session and our speakers, these are the sorts of questions that a business is asking about the impact of those that are about to disrupt them or might. So this is the sort of Peter perspective, if you like, rather than the Francis perspective. And Peter could be asking questions about how do we identify real improvement opportunities versus the noise? And we certainly know in education with the ICTs and the possibilities, a lot of noise, a lot of promise. Where do you go? Do you start small? The discussion in the prior session around how DFAT is pursuing a small in-house pilot. But in education, we know people laugh at pilots. They say you're not committed. So how do we start? Small, or do we make wholesale change? When do you shift resources to the new? You know, how is a big university, how's a big education system going to make the decision when the resources shift? And what about the old? And then how do you know when the new normal's there and how to transition? So they're the sort of questions I'm interested in hearing about. So I will hand over to my previous boss, Peter Dawkins, and dear colleague, to take us through his perspective. Thanks, Peter.
Well, thanks very much, Dale, and great to be here. I think you've set that session up, or this session up, extremely well. So the disrupted and the disruptor. Although I think, you know, that a leader in the traditional system has a responsibility to foster some disruption, or else we could face really serious challenges unless we innovate significantly. And I think disruptors can be very helpful to us as well as a threat. So very good setup, and my task is to talk about how to respond to this environment in the education sector from the perspective of an education leader who's held leadership responsibilities from early childhood to schools to vocational and higher education. As Dale said, both as the State Government Department Secretary and now as a Vice Chancellor of a dual sector university with higher education and vocational education in my institution. And looking back over the last 10 years, I was 5 years Department Secretary, 5 years of being a Vice Chancellor, and I've signed up for another 5. That last 10 years has been the big period of change and the decade in which digital disruption has started to have a major impact on education, although it does have a longer fuse, I think, in the education sector than in some other sectors. And some people were predicting revolution and decay of the old to happen by now, and it is taking a bit longer, but it's definitely happening. And I think it's likely that disruption will accelerate over the next decade. And I think when you hear from Francis, you will see plenty of evidence of the acceleration of disruption of the digital kind. It's also a decade in which government at the state and federal level have adopted a more deregulated approach particularly to tertiary education, less so to primary or secondary, which has also had a disruptive effect. And having lived and worked through this decade in my different roles, I'm reaching the conclusion that that globalisation and technological transformation is gradually making old models of education obsolete, and new models are emerging and will continue to do so. It's, as I say, it's only been gradual so far, but I think it does need to accelerate, and I also think public policy has a role to encourage it. In a modern knowledge economy, a successful education, I think, needs a personalised approach to unlock the potential of all people, and this is a key to economic development and social inclusion. But in Australia, I think education policy has stalled, and we need to put together a comprehensive education strategy from early childhood to postgraduate education that's in tune with the new world and encourages innovation and adaptation over time. So that's my basic storyline, and I'll now have a go at sort of laying it out in a little bit more detail. So starting off with a broad historical context. We are now going through what some people call the fourth, or entering the fourth industrial revolution. The first and second industrial revolution drastically reduced the number of agricultural workers and increased the number of workers, the number of sort of the working class in the industrial age. And thus education aimed to prepare employees. Starting in the 1950s, the computing technology began to advance and automation began to replace human workers, and thus the decline of workers, and there was the decline of the traditional working class and the rise of the creative and the service class. And as we move into the fourth industrial revolution, which involves the Internet of Things, robotics, artificial intelligence, autonomous vehicles, 3D printing, nanotechnology, biotechnology, material science, energy storage, quantum computing, and so on, we increasingly need a different kind of education that prepares entrepreneurial-minded innovators and creators. There's a lot of uncertainty about how this will play out, but one thing that I believe is that there is an emerging consensus that relative to capital, talent will increasingly represent the critical factor of production, and the role of education is to develop each individual's talents to the full. Now, in putting this position, I have been quite strongly influenced by Professor Yong Zhao, who's a professorial fellow at the Mitchell Institute of Victoria University, which is our research institute / think tank on education. And Yong Zhao is an international figure, an American, of Chinese origin, American professor now at Kansas University, who is being very influential in thinking about and influencing thinking about these changes. And the way he puts it is that the old model, and he talks particularly about schooling, the old paradigm is one that aims to impose upon all students similar sets of skills and prescribed knowledge based on an understanding of existing jobs, so that students can be employed in traditional jobs of the old industrial order. So there you see all these individual differences, multiple intelligence, cultural diversity, curiosity, passion, creativity, but being channeled into something more homogenous to create the employable skills for the old order. His argument is, and I'm signed up supporter of this view, having observed what's happened over the last decade, is that in the new paradigm, we should be taking advantage of all of that diversity, the cultural diversity, the curiosity, the passion, the creativity, the individual differences, the multiple intelligences, and it's about enhancing human talents, which means that we have to have an individualised, personalised approach to learning that builds the talents of the population, which is what's going to be the really strategic assets of the future. And we should focus on enhancing individual uniqueness and cultivate creativity and the entrepreneurial mindset so that they can actually create jobs and opportunities in an uncertain world. Now, so that's my kind of basic view about the way education needs to change at all levels, from early childhood through to tertiary education. Now, before I go on to say what I think this means for educational reform, I'll just give you a few examples of how digital disruption or innovation over the last decade, and as I say, it's accelerating, and when you hear what Francis has got to hear, you'll hear about much more disruption that's coming through now. But over the last decade, all sorts of things from digital, the digital revolution, have been influencing the way that schools and universities operate. You'll all have heard about MOOCs, massive online open courses, which for a while there people thought would destroy universities, and this is where organisations like Coursera latch on to content from different universities and make it available to massive numbers of people, typically free. That, of course, raised questions about what's the business model, how do you actually make this thing successful, and they have increasingly found ways to get some business value out of it. But in many ways, MOOCs have turned out to be quite helpful to the traditional sector because they've been a resource that we've been able to use. In universities now, the learning commons have replaced libraries, and they're a very popular place for students to go. That's where all the digital resources and the coffee shops are. They're more popular than the classes, because the classes you can record the lectures and watch them in the coffee shop. And of course, blended learning is progressing forward in terms of face-to-face and digital and online, students bringing their own device, what's called flipped classrooms. All those things there, computer gaming. Learning analytics, of course, is terrific, associated with the digital learning, the online learning, some really great analytical capability to understand the progress we're making in learning. Entrepreneurship education, in my view, and it links with this philosophy that we have to be developing people with entrepreneurial capability, is of critical importance, and that's something that I'm really promoting very strongly at my university. So these are the sorts of things that have been happening over the last decade, are happening now within the traditional system, but of course a lot of it outside as well, and an interplay between the two, and that interplay between the two, say a bit more about that in a minute. And so the most progressive schools, for example, there's the Hellerup School in Denmark, which is quite different from the kind of school that most of us probably went to, where spaces are completely different. Kids can operate individually or in groups using online resources, develops teamwork, develops individuality. That's a good example of one that's going with the new way. Some examples of innovations at Victoria University. We have invested in new learning spaces in blended learning strategy in what's called flipped classrooms, where students are expected to use the digital resource to master or to get on top of the core content rather than just being taught, but then they come into these spaces to discuss and collaborate and meet with their tutors and so on. There's my entrepreneur in residence, Gus Belbontin there, that I brought in as a disruptor within the organisation. Introduced a startup school for there's the students who won the first hackathon in our startup school. A collaboration with local and state government and schools. We're based in Footscray in the inner west of Melbourne, and one of the things that needs to happen, in my view, is the different parts of the system need to be more open and more porous and more integrated, and so we're working to get the primary and the secondary and the tertiary institutions working together in a precinct kind of way, taking advantage of digital capability, providing an individualised learning that draws on the resources of the whole precinct as opposed to the individual institution. So there's some of the examples going on within the traditional system. Now, I'm going to come to some of the disruptors in a minute, but you'll hear more about that from Francis. But in terms of the education strategy that I think is needed, I said that I thought education policy stalled in Australia, and this is my kind of 8-point plan. So the first one being that we need to assume that digital technologies and associated digital literacy are sort of part of the furniture. There used to be a debate about whether we should do digital learning or not. Well, that's a redundant question, I think, with the digital natives that we're teaching. So he assumes that digital technologies and associated digital literacy are part of the furniture, and then focus on what our students really need in addition to digital literacy. Secondly, focuses on developing the particular talents and motivations of all students. Thirdly, assumes that students will all need to progress to tertiary education. So there's this debate about, have we expanded the tertiary education system too much? I think that's another silly debate. So in the 21st century, most people will need a tertiary education. If they're going to succeed in life, the evidence on that is pretty clear. So it's a matter of making sure that they succeed rather than putting hurdles in their way to stop them getting there. Acknowledges, of course, that tertiary learning experiences and primary and secondary of the future will be completely different. It's, as I say, much more vertically integrated from preschool to tertiary and horizontally with industry and community. Privileges problem solving and entrepreneurship much more than traditional education, which focuses much more on specific content. Recognises the global context in which we operate and emphasises the importance of cross-cultural understanding and collaboration. And to Dale's point about how do we deal with change in the traditional system, we do have to undoubtedly encourage experimentation and then seek to enable successful innovation at scale. Now, it's easy to write down an 8-point plan, harder to implement it, and particularly when I talk about a vertically integrated from preschool to postgraduate and horizontally with industry and community. In a federal state kind of arrangements that we've got in Australia, this is quite challenging given the different government responsibilities. But I think it's very important to do this. And one way we're thinking about doing it in Footscray, of course, is with this learning precinct where you've got all levels together. Let's see if we can put a bit of a boundary around it and see whether we can find a way of working together, even though we're responding to different regulators and different governments, to have an integrated approach to the lifelong learning of all students in this individualised way. So that's the comprehensive education strategy. Let's say something about the emerging new business models. Coursera was probably the first best known MOOC. Lynda is another MOOC, although this one's owned by LinkedIn, so it can, many of you I'm sure are on LinkedIn and may have been offered Lynda to give you some professional development, and they can leverage off the information you provide them to help you get the kind of professional development that you need. I won't say a lot about these because I'll run out of time, but Stanford 2025 is a large-scale design thinking exercise run in conjunctions with people from local startups in the Stanford area. I'll come to Minerva in a minute because I've got another slide on that one. The Chaos pilot there is a hybrid business and design school, focused very much on entrepreneurship. The Khan Academy, so most of these are tertiary. The Khan Academy is one that started as a one-person tutoring his cousin online using YouTube videos, and now is an 80-person not-for-profit. And this is aimed at the school age rather than tertiary, and its basic premise is learn anything, anytime, for free, and uses instructional videos, personalised learning dashboard. Tech Futures Lab you will hear about from Frances, which will be a very exciting presentation about her own entity. Going back to Minerva, this one is sort of challenging Harvard at the elite end. And you'll see here that the students who sign up for Minerva over 4 years of intensive studies explore up to 7 vibrant cities, each with unique global significance, from San Francisco and London to Buenos Aires and Seoul. And Minerva doesn't have its own infrastructure, it just uses spaces in all of these countries to develop this very exciting cross-cultural education with a lot of digital content, and some people are choosing Minerva over Harvard. So it's not just the ordinary mainstream universities that have been challenged by the disruptors. It's the elite universities as well. So how am I going? I've done quite well. I've got 10 minutes, so I can give you 10 minutes of conclusions. So to summarise, economic development and digital disruption are driving us towards a new paradigm, and the fundamental proposition is that the emphasis needs to be on personalised learning to enhance human talents. And I think that might sound unexceptional to you, that that's what the education system should be about. And many of us with our own children, think that's what education should be about. But it really is a completely different way of thinking about an education system to develop the talents of each and every individual and all of their multiple intelligences. And I think, and I was, a secretary in the Department of Education when this very strong focus on the NAPLAN and on the literacy and numeracy testing came in, and all the states and territories signed up with the Commonwealth around this. And there's nothing wrong with improving literacy and numeracy, but it became a very fanatical focus on a very narrow set of skills, and and tended to stimulate very unexciting teaching and learning. And the NAPLAN results have come out today, and again we're moaning about the fact that the NAPLAN results haven't gone up. But the major issue in our school system, in my view, and the Mitchell Institute at Victoria University has done a lot of work to document this problem, is kids are increasingly becoming disengaged from their school experience. And you won't improve literacy and numeracy amongst disengaged kids. They need to be engaged, they need to be engaged digitally, they need to be engaged physically. For example, had a very impressive presentation from Dick Telford, who was the first sports scientist at Australian Institute of Sport the other day at Victoria University, in which he'd done this study of the effect of introducing physical education in primary school years, and it had a significant positive impact on NAPLAN tests. And that's because you have to educate the whole person, you have to educate all of their capabilities, you have to develop all of their talents, focus of course on their particular talents. But I definitely think we made a retrograde step in this excessive focus on the narrow skills of the kind of industrial age. And that's not to say NAPLAN hasn't got a part to play, but we also need to be measuring other capabilities, developing other capabilities, and particularly developing the unique talents of each individual. We need a comprehensive education strategy from early childhood to postgraduate education that embraces this change, this personalised learning in a more integrated way from early childhood to tertiary, expecting that everybody needs to go through to tertiary, whether it be vocational education or higher education. And that's another of our challenges, that the way we've designed vocational education and higher education is like chalk and cheese, whereas when young people leave school, they should be given a menu of opportunities across the vocational and academic spectrum that are not chalk and cheese, but are designed to meet their needs in supporting their aspirations and their careers. New models are emerging that have an important role in this, that are using digital resources, that are using new spaces, that are operating across countries, that are using new business models. And policy needs to promote innovation and partnership between public providers from the old system and innovative providers, often private operators, to import new ideas. Now, we've seen one or two experiments recently about bringing private providers into a publicly funded system, and there was one in Victoria in vocational education training, which was pretty well a disaster because the way it was done, far from being demand-driven, it became supply-driven, where too many private providers were basically chasing the dollar, and rather than providing skills into the labour market. So you have to be very careful about the way in which you open up the public system, the public funding to private operators. But so that's all about market design, getting the incentives right. And one aspect of that I think is critical is very good and effective partnerships between the traditional system and innovative providers, as well as fostering innovation from within, which I think's, Dale, a good segue to a very innovative disruptor as the next speaker.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thanks.